I'm very glad that we have a very distinguished panel here today. We'll start with overall perspective of the environmental and so the long-term challenge of climate change and environmental issues, and the short-term challenge, what's going on in the COVID crisis, and what will be the new normal or the Great Reset. We continue with two perspectives, but before and afterwards, after the general overview and the global perspective, we continue with two perspectives, from one from the German automotive industry, and then of Toyota, so a Japanese car manufacturer. We should not forget that both our countries are leading markets and leading countries in production of cars, and therefore the challenges of transforming the industry and the technology are very important for both our countries. That was one of the reasons why we took that topic today. But before I introduce our speakers, I would like to give a few remarks and show you a few charts on what we are talking about. The first and very long-term issue that we have, and we didn't start having it just a couple of years ago, but for almost 30 years now, is that there's a need of decline of carbon emissions globally in all sectors, and as well in mobility. And we've seen that in Europe, carbon emissions from passenger cars were on the rise since the early 90s, then went down from the mid-2000s until about 2012, 2013, and unfortunately are on the rise again. So that means that there's still a way to go to organize mobility in a carbon-neutral way. On the next slide, we see that the efficiency of the fleets have been increasing for the last years. So, for example, from 2007 to 2018, a little more than a decade, in Germany, the average consumption has been reduced by 27%, or average carbon emissions have been reduced by 27%. But in the meantime, there has been more traffic, so after all, emissions haven't been gone down as much as necessary. So we have that global and therefore as well regional and national challenge, but we also have on a global scale a lot of regulation regarding fuel consumption or carbon emissions, which is on the next slide. And we see here that all the major markets, so the United States, the European Union, and also Japan and China, the standards for current and future carbon emissions are going down step by step, and right at the moment Europe is even a little stricter than all the others, a little bit stricter than Japan, but also stricter than the United States. So that describes the regulatory challenge for the automotive industry. They have to reduce emissions of the cars, have to reduce emissions of the fleets. And maybe probably one of the most important means to do that is to introduce electric vehicles into the market. And on the next slide, we see that in Europe, over the last quarters, the market share of electric vehicles increased. Right now, it's about 4% of new registrations are battery electric vehicles, another 3% are plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, and then the largest share, 11%, are hybrids. And the situation is similar in Germany, which is on the next slide. We have a little longer timeline here. It started 2012 with still pretty low registration figures, but those increased. And again, here it's 5% battery electric vehicles, 6% plug-in electric vehicles, so the share is even higher than in European average. There's a trend towards electric mobility, but it's still far from dominant in the markets. What we also see on the next slide is that the markets for electric vehicles are very diverse internationally. We see very different market shares. It's 2% in the US in 2019, up to 56% in Norway. But we also see that there are very different companies selling the cars, and especially in China, which is with a market share of 5%, electric vehicles are not too strong. But with almost every second electric vehicle sold in China, it's by far the biggest market. And we see a lot of companies which are not the traditional European or German or US or Japanese companies. So that's a situation where new companies, new competitors can gain market share, which is another challenge for the traditional and the established car makers in both our countries. So that's one part of our story today, one part of our discussion today, what to do about that long-term trend, what to do in terms of reducing carbon emissions and remaining competitive under these circumstances. And the other main challenge starts on the next slide, is that we have experienced with the COVID crisis starting earlier this year, not only a big challenge for conferences like ours, but especially for the automotive industry. We see that transport is going down. On that chart, you see we have counted how many cars, we have analyzed it, and we've seen that during the peak of the German lockdown, car traffic went down by 60% and truck traffic by minus 30%. So we see the economic recession and the economic lockdown, we see it pretty good in mobility. That went back a bit, still at the beginning of the summer holidays. Passenger transport was a bit more than minus 20%. Goods transport, so trucks, a little less than minus 20%, which also demonstrates that we are still in that in that very critical situation. Now, could we believe that's a good thing in terms of the environment? And that's on the next chart. There we see the fuel market, and the second to last column is April 2020, so the lockdown situation where fuel sales went down on petrol and on diesel, so petrol, passenger transport, diesel, passenger and goods transport. And of course, less fuel sold also means less carbon emissions, but that's probably not the answer. We see on the next chart a massive drop of new car registrations in all over Europe and the US and Japan. Minus 20% in Japan, minus 24% in the US, 23% in China, and in Europe between minus 35% in Germany and minus 50% in Spain and the UK. So that's a real hard hit for our industry. And one of the questions is, will that hard hit, which costs an awful lot of money, be an obstacle in transforming the industry into a more transport sector, into a more environmental and climate-friendly sector? We asked that especially in Germany, but also in Japan, because the automotive industry is the most important part of our manufacturing sector. It's responsible in Germany for 20% or 21% of value added, 35% of investments, and 22% of the capital stock. It's 12% of the employees and 60% of the wage bills. So that's not nothing. That's a really important sector, and that's only the automotive industry. That's not the suppliers or not the supplying sectors in the, for example, chemical industry and automation and so on, which again adds quite a lot on the relevance of the automotive industry. We also see that the automotive industry is responsible for almost every second patent which is filed in Germany. And that sector, that share increased during the last 10 years from 30% to 47%. Two answers or two interpretations are possible. One is we are too dependent on the automotive industry, and the other one is the automotive industry is getting more and more innovative. And I think innovation is, and the last element of our talk today, of our session here, is a key for shaping the future of that sector and shaping the future of mobility. Today, last slide, the average age of the licensed cars in Germany is almost 10 years. In other countries in Europe, it's even more, 12, 13, 14 years. So that's an obstacle. That means the older the cars get, the older the technologies are and the emission rates are. We need to invest in the industry. We need to also invest into the fleets to get the innovations that we have and innovations that we must have in the next years onto the street and really develop towards more sustainable and more climate-friendly transport sector in Germany, in the European Union, and in Japan and all over the world. So that's my remarks to introduce some of the aspects that we may or may not talk about during the next hour.